So now types of respiration that occur inside the cell. So there are two types of respiration on the basis of availability of oxygen. So on the basis of availability of oxygen, respiration, cellular respiration is of two types. They are aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. If oxygen is available inside the cell, then it leads to aerobic respiration. And if oxygen is not available inside the cell, then that is called anaerobic respiration. Let's see what happens in this aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So I am going to give you overview of aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Okay, right. So what we discussed, the most common type of respiratory substrate is carbohydrate. So these carbohydrates which are present inside the cell undergoes breakdown into glucose. This is 6-carbon hexo sugar. So now this glucose undergoes breakdown or oxidation through a series of reactions into two molecules of pyruvic acid. Through a series of reactions, this glucose undergoes partial oxidation or partial breakdown into two molecules of pyruvic acid. So this pyruvic acid is 3-carbon compound, which is 3-carbon compound. Now, this pathway through which glucose undergoes partial breakdown into two molecules of pyruvic acid is called as glycolysis. Glycolysis. Now this glycolysis is common for both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. That means this pathway, glycolysis, is universal in any type of organism, whether it is aerobe or anaerobic organism. This glycolysis occurs. Now after formation of pyruvic acid, if oxygen is available inside the cell or inside that organism, what happens? This pyruvic acid enters into aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration, that means pyruvic acid undergoes further oxidation through this aerobic respiration into further oxidation through aerobic respiration, where it undergoes complete oxidation, complete breakdown, complete oxidation or complete breakdown into what? Carbon dioxide, water, and large amount of energy is released. Okay. If oxygen is not available inside the cell, then what happens? These two molecules of pyruvic acid enter into fermentation. So through this fermentation, pyruvic acid undergoes partial oxidation into either alcohol or lactic acid. If it undergoes partial oxidation into alcohol, that is called alcoholic fermentation. If it is forming lactic acid, that is called lactic acid fermentation. So fermentation. So this fermentation is nothing but anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration. So when this pyruvic acid enters into anaerobic respiration, in the absence of oxygen, what happens? It will be converted into either alcohol or lactic acid. So alcohol plus carbon dioxide and very little amount of energy is released. Whereas in case of aerobic respiration, large amount of energy is released. Very large amount of energy, whereas in case of fermentation or anaerobic respiration, very small amount of energy is released. Okay, now this pyruvic acid can form lactic acid also in some organisms in the absence of oxygen. So lactic acid plus energy is released. Very little small amount of energy is released. So what happens? Carbohydrate is the most favored substrate, respiratory substrate. These carbohydrates, stored carbohydrates present inside the cell, undergo breakdown or oxidation into glucose. That glucose undergoes partial oxidation into two molecules of pyruvic acid through a series of reactions, and that pathway in which glucose undergoes partial oxidation or breakdown into two molecules of pyruvic acid, 3-carbon compound, is called as glycolysis. And this glycolysis is common for both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. It occurs in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Okay, now this pyruvic acid enters into either aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration. based on the basis of availability of oxygen. If oxygen is available, it undergoes oxidation, complete oxidation through aerobic respiration into carbon dioxide, water, and large amount of energy is released. Whereas if oxygen is not available inside the cell, now pyruvic acid, 2 molecules of pyruvic acid undergoes partial oxidation through fermentation into either alcohol or lactic acid. If it is forming alcohol, that is called alcoholic fermentation, and if it is forming lactic acid, that is called lactic acid fermentation. So alcohol plus carbon dioxide and very small amount of energy is released in case of alcoholic fermentation. In case of lactic acid fermentation, lactic acid, energy and small amount of energy. Lactic acid and small amount of energy is released. So this is the overview of types of respiration, that is aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So this aerobic respiration involves, it occurs by Krebs cycle. So what happens first? First glycolysis occurs. After glycolysis, 2 molecules of pyruvic acid is formed. That pyruvic acid undergoes complete oxidation into carbon dioxide, water and some amount of energy through this cyclic pathway called Krebs cycle. So after Krebs cycle, then actually by the end of Krebs cycle, energy is released in the form of ATP, energy is synthesized. The heat energy is released in the form of heat energy. That heat energy is trapped to synthesize ATP, NADH2 and FADH2. NADH2 and FADH2. So this ATP is the energy currency of the cell, but this NADH2 and FADH2 are high energy intermediates. High energy intermediates because again they undergo oxidation through breakdown or oxidation through another pathway called ETS, electron transport system, or ETC, electron transport chain, through which ATP is formed again. Finally ATP is formed. So why these two forms of energy is undergoing further breakdown? Because energy which is stored inside the cell in the form of NADH2 and FADH2 cannot be utilized by the cell for other energy requiring process, and hence this NADH2 and FADH2 undergoes further breakdown through a process, through a pathway, metabolic pathway called ETS, electron transport system or electron transport chain, through which ultimately ATP is formed. So this is the overview of aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Now I am going to give you the sites where all these pathways occurs, that is glycolysis, Krebs cycle, ETS and even fermentation. Site of respiratory pathways. Okay, right. So what are the different respiratory pathways in aerobic respiration? First, let's study about sites of different pathways of aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration. Okay, glycolysis, Krebs cycle and ETS or ETC, electron transport system or electron transport chain. Okay, let's study the sites in case of prokaryotes and in case of eukaryotes. Okay, in case of prokaryotes and eukaryotes, this glycolysis occurs inside the cytoplasm of the cell. So the site of glycolysis, the site where this pathway glycolysis occurs inside the cell is cytoplasm in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Next, coming to Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle occurs in cytoplasm only in prokaryotes, because in case of prokaryotes there are no membrane bound cell organelles. Hence this Krebs cycle also occurs inside the cytoplasm of the cell, prokaryotic cell. In case of eukaryotes, as membrane bound cell organelles are present, the Krebs cycle occurs in mitochondrial matrix. inside the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, next coming to ETS or ETC. So this ETS or ETC, electron transport chain, occurs on the surface of inner mitochondrial membrane. Inner mitochondrial membrane, because the enzymes which are required for this ETS or ETC, enzymes and other carriers, electron carriers present in electron transport system, are present on the surface of inner mitochondrial membrane. Whereas in case of prokaryotes, this mitochondrion is absent. So it occurs on the surface of cytoplasmic membrane, that is cell membrane or plasma membrane. Cytoplasmic membrane or cell membrane or plasma membrane. In case of prokaryotes, only one cell membrane is present or one plasma membrane is present. That is the cell membrane which covers the entire cytoplasm of the cell. Hence, prokaryotes are called as single enveloped system. Whereas in case of eukaryotes, many membranes are present, because the membrane which covers the entire cytoplasm of the cell, along with that other membranes are present which are surrounding the cell organelles, like mitochondrion is double membrane bound cell organelle, nucleus double membrane bound, chloroplast double membrane bound. Like this, many cell membranes are present in case of eukaryotes, but in case of prokaryotes, only one cell membrane is present, that is plasma membrane, on the surface of which the enzyme and other carriers which are required for electron transport system or electron transport chain are present. Okay, so this is all about different sites of aerobic respiration which occurs in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. In the next class, let's start with the glycolysis, which is the common pathway of both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So it is universal in all types of organisms, aerobes and anaerobes, and even in prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Thank you, students.